name is Deb Van Dynen. I'm an Associate Professor of English Education at Hope College, and I'm the Director of the NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore programs. The NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore programs are Hope College programs in partnership with many area libraries, businesses, institutions, and organizations. The purpose of the NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore programs is for people to come together around a story. However, it's not just coming together and reading the same story. We really want people to use the book and its topics and themes as a springboard to listen and learn from each other, to learn more about our community and the world at large. Come join us this year as together we read An American Sunrise, a book of poems by Joy Harjo. For our Little Read program, we invite you to read Fry Bread, a Native American family story by Kevin Millard. Please visit our website, bigreadlakeshore.com, to find out more about our events, our programs, our guiding questions, and more about who we are and what we do along the lakeshore.
Hello and welcome to our presentation tonight from Wilder's Little House on the Prairie to Harjo's American Sunrise, Words Matter with Dr. Debbie Reese. My name is Katie and I'm a senior here at Hope College. And tonight my classmates and I are from our English 375 class, Children's and Young Adult Literature course, taught by Dr. Postma Montano, and we will be hosting this event. And we are so glad you can join to hear it from Dr. Reese. As we begin, I would like to respectfully share this land acknowledgement. Together, we acknowledge that we gather at Hope College on the traditional land of the Peoria, Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic inequities that stem directly from past wrongdoings. We are grateful for the ways in which stories and words can speak truth and shed insight into these inequalities and wrongdoings, and also provide a way forward towards equality, justice, and understanding. Through these big read events and beyond, we commit to respecting and reconciling this long history of injustice and commit to be better stewards of this land we inhabit.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, my name is Carol, and I'm a sophomore studying English and Women's and Gender Studies. We would like to welcome and thank Dr. Debbie Reese for joining in a conversation about the power of words in Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie and Joy Harjo's American Sunrise. Dr. Reese was raised and is tribally enrolled at Nambe-Awinge, a sovereign native nation in northern New Mexico. She grew up on the Nambe Reservation, where she learned dances and ceremonies from family members and elders. She went on to receive her BA in teaching from the University of New Mexico, an MA in school administration from the University of Oklahoma, and her PhD in education from the University of Illinois. She also received a master's in library and information studies from San Jose State University in California. Dr. Reese's extensive research and writing are centered on representations of Native Americans in children's literature, popular culture, and school materials. Her work, including the American Indians in Children's Literature website, is an essential resource for education practitioners today. In this lecture, Dr. Reese will share with us about the works of Wilder and Harjo and ask us to consider how their words shape what readers know about the place called America and the people that call it home. Our class, English 375, Children's and Young Adult Literature, at Hope College, has been focusing on similar issues this semester, looking specifically at social identities and representation in the literature consumed by young readers. I, for one, look forward to hearing the deep wisdom and insight Dr. Reese has to share on the topic. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Reese.
Hey, Dr. Reese, we actually can't hear you. Do you mind unmuting yourself for us?
Okay, sorry about that. Now let's try this screen share again. Oh boy. That's funny because you didn't hear me making all these noises when I thought, oh no, it's not working. Okay, can you see my title slide? I need someone to unmute and say yes.
We can see it. You're all
Okay. And you can hear me too?
Yes, we can.
All right, so I will begin. Gunta, that's thank you in Tewa, my language. I want to thank the people at Hope College who organized this year's Big Read and invited me to participate, and I want to thank all of you who are watching this evening's presentation online. I've titled it, From Wilder's Little House on the Prairie to Harjo's American Sunrise, Words Matter. In her lecture for you on October 25th of this year, Muskogee Creek author Joy Harjo said that, quote, in the American imagination, we exist as stereotypes. We are not human beings. She also said that by the end of her life, she wants to see that we are seen as human beings. The emphasis of my work is, in a nutshell, asking who said it? Who wrote it? Who drew it? It, in my questions, is a depiction of a Native person in the children or young adults book. That's pretty much how I want to approach books. That's how I want you to approach books, asking questions about the people who wrote the book and about the people who review and talk about books. Who wrote the book? Who is the critic? You're here tonight to listen to me, so we'll start by answering that second question. Just who is Debbie Reese? In 1959, I was born into a tribal nation called Nambe-Owinge. I'm a tribal member of Nambe-Owinge. You're looking at our tribal flag. Nambe is a sovereign nation in what is currently called the state of New Mexico. You see those little letters at the bottom, established in 1300 AD at the bottom of our tribal flag? Nambe and all the tribal nations are much older than any of the states of the United States. In fact, tribal nations were nations before the United States was a nation. For hundreds of years, leaders of tribal nations entered into diplomatic negotiations with leaders of other tribal nations and with leaders of European nations, and then, of course, with leaders of the United States. All of this diplomacy led to legal agreements and treaties. A native nation has the power to determine who its citizens are, just like any nation does. Because Nambe recognizes me as a tribal member, I can do things like vote in tribal elections. My statements about being a tribal member have ramifications for how I live my life. I bet you know somebody who says that they're part Cherokee. That is a very popular claim. You can ask them, are you a citizen of one of the 3 federally recognized Cherokee nations? If they say yes, you can ask them which one. If they seem surprised by your use of federally recognized, that phrase, or if they're surprised by your use of the word nation, you might be talking to someone who's just telling you a family story, a story that's not rooted in fact, and someone who may not have the experiences of living with or talking with or being part of the Cherokee people in the present day. They probably don't know much at all about the very people that they claim to be. If you've been following Native news media, you're likely aware of ongoing conversations and news items about people who've made claims to a Native identity and who've been speaking or performing or writing as if they are Native when they're not. An older example is the book and film, The Education of Little Tree. It was written by a man who took the name Forrest Carter and said he was Cherokee. That book appealed to a white audience whose imagination of who the Cherokee people are is that stereotype that Joy Harjo referenced. In fact, Forrest Carter's real name was Asa Carter. He was a member of the KKK and was a speechwriter for George Wallace. Was anyone harmed by his fraudulent claim? I think so. Cherokee children who were asked to read that book or watch that film and knew because of the teachings they had from their family members, knew the contents of that book was wrong. Any others who felt they were learning something about Cherokees were being misinformed. Those words were shaping those people in ungood ways. This structure is our kiva. It's like a temple or a church. Religious and spiritual ceremonies take place in there and in the building next to it. On certain days, you could come to Nambe and be present for our dances. Dance for us is not entertainment or performance, it's prayer. Think of all the other religions in the world. You don't clap or applaud when they finish praying, when a prayer is finished. And you wouldn't clap or applaud if you were at Nambe for one of our dances. To get to Nambe, you drive about 25 miles north of Santa Fe. You'd pass this sign, and once you do, you're on our land. You're under tribal jurisdiction of Nambe Owinge. If you're driving too fast, you might get a ticket, and you'd pay that at the tribal court office. Sovereign nations can tell you how fast you'll drive on our land. Now, that's kind of a simple example of what it means to be a sovereign nation, but it's the one I think most people can understand. Jurisdiction itself is complicated, but understanding what it means for tribal groups to have that status, sovereign nation status, is important. It distinguishes us from other groups. There are several groups in the United States today that are commonly thought of as minorities or marginalized or underrepresented, but we, American Indians, are tribal members or citizens of sovereign nations. Erasing our political status or not talking about it or not bringing it forward when you talk, speak, or write about us is wrong. We're here tonight because you've chosen to read Joy Harjo's American Sunrise as a community read. This sentence here is from the NEA website. It says, showcasing a diverse range of titles that reflect many different voices and perspectives, the NEA Big Read aims to inspire conversation and discovery. The website does not have the word perspectives or inspire in bold font. I did that because that's what I want to do tonight. I want to talk about perspective and that word inspire. I'm the oldest of 5 kids. I loved school. I even got a certificate at the end of the year for having the best grades. I'd come home from our day school that was part of the government boarding school system, the same day school that my father and my grandmother went to, and I'd make my little sisters be my students. You could say, going back to that time, that for over 50 years I have been teaching. First it was my siblings, but then I got a teaching degree from the University of New Mexico and taught at a public elementary school in New Mexico, and then a boarding school for Native children in Oklahoma. In 1994, I moved to Illinois to get a PhD in education at the University of Illinois. And there, I taught in the College of Ed as a graduate student, and then later in library science and American Indian Studies as a lecturer and assistant professor. I left the university in 2011 and got a library science degree from San Jose State. And since then, I've done a lot of lectures, workshops, and webinars in the United States and Canada. I've been an educator for a long time. That's where my heart is, and that's what I'm doing here tonight. The NEA wants the big read to inspire you. As an educator who has spent the last 30 years in the Midwest, where people know very little about Native peoples, I want you to be inspired to take action about ignorance. Surely some of you know what I'm talking about. The things that children are taught in school, the books they are asked to read. I want you to interrupt that cycle of ignorance. That means talking with others about what I share with you tonight. As a community, you are reading An American Sunrise. With action in mind, I want you to read Joy Harjo's words in a larger context. That larger context is children and what they are asked to read. Children, of course, are a part of your community. I do a lot of workshops with teachers and librarians. We spend an hour or so reading aloud and discussing passages from Little House on the Prairie. Ones like, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Invariably, They are stunned as we do this. They don't remember these passages. In New Mexico, a librarian was emotionally upset as we discussed the book. The previous day, she said, she had checked it out to a native girl. Often somebody will express disbelief that anybody would use such an old book today. And without fail, someone else in the room will say, they're using it at my school. When I ask groups if it's being read critically for its misrepresentations of Native people in history, the answer is no. I have yet to hear or receive a report from a teacher or a school, from anyone, anywhere, that they are reading the book critically. This map is from American Sunrise. It shows the journey that Harjo's Muskogee Creek ancestors took in 1836. But really, journey is not quite the right word. In her poem, Running, one of the poems in American Sunrise, Harjo says that we left home with the American soldiers at our backs. The Muskogee Creek people left their homelands in 1836 and went through what we currently call the states of Tennessee and Arkansas and arrived at Fort Gibson in what was then called Indian Territory. There, they made new homes and farms and schools and banks and towns. They brought a lot of know-how with them. And those who had plantations brought the people they had enslaved with them as well. In recent years, we're seeing more conversations about Black Indians. That's a good thing. 33 years later, in 1869, Charles Ingalls and his family, which included 2-year-old Laura, set out from Wisconsin. People think that book is autobiographical, but it's not. When they left Wisconsin, Laura was not the little girl you see in the book. In fact, she was only 2 years old. What you read in the Little House books is the outcome of her research on family members and their experiences, turned into ones that seem like they are hers. On page 1 of chapter 1 of Little House on the Prairie, we read these words. They were going to the Indian country. I want you to see these two maps and think about them together because they're a snapshot of time of two peoples of this place called the United States of America. We have families of an indigenous nation being removed from their homes and homelands by military force. And we have a white family choosing to leave their home to settle, not settle, to squat, actually, on lands that belong to the Osage Nation. But what does Laura Ingalls Wilder tell us about the Native peoples who were in Indian Territory? Let's look. We're going to look at some of these selected passages from Little House on the Prairie. On page 2, Pa promised that when they came to the west, Laura should see a papoose. What is a papoose? She asked him, and he said, a papoose is a little brown Indian baby. Except it's not. Papoose is commonly thought of as the Indian word for baby. If you do crossword puzzles, you've probably come across it there. But there's over 500 different sovereign nations. We don't all speak the same language, and we all have our own words for baby. Laura's desire to see a papoose comes up 2 other times. In the workshops I do, we talk about how Wilder depicts a native infant as something to look at, much like people look at baby animals in a zoo. On page 55, Laura remembers that Pa said, you never saw Indians unless they wanted you to see them. From him, Laura had learned that they were wild men with red skins. In my workshops, we talk about how that knowledge dovetails with paintings in the Rotunda in Washington, D.C., and in illustrations in children's books. Indians crouch, hidden in the bushes, peeking out at white people. In countless books, they're depicted as wild men with red skin. On page 122, Ma says, dear me, Laura, must you yell like an Indian? I trust you've heard someone, maybe your own mother, call out something similar to that. When my daughter was about 4 years old, we were at a play date at a local playground with a white woman and her children. At one point, that white woman called out, "Girls, quit yelling like a bunch of wild Indians." And then she turned to me, wide-eyed and horrified with what she had just said. She was sorry. She was sincerely sorry. She apologized, and of course, the ball was then in my court. I have no clear memory of what I said. The play date didn't end, so I must have accepted the apology. I bet she never said that phrase again. But what if we had never met? Would she continue to use that phrase? I hear people say similar things. Circle the wagons. They talk about how some politician is off the reservation and how we should all bury the hatchet. When you hear these phrases, I'd like you to take action. I'd like you to interrupt that cycle of ignorance, interrupt these stereotypes that Joy Harjo wants us to look at. Most of the time, people in workshops that I do are easily able to see what's wrong with these passages, the ones that we just went over. But this page is harder. At this point in the story, Laura and Mary watched these two Indian men go into the little house where Ma and baby Carrie are. Terrified, they run inside. Entering the house, Laura smelled a horribly bad smell and ducked behind a long, narrow slab against the wall. From there, she watches the wild men. The text there, some of it reads, "Around their waists, each of the Indians wore a leather thong, and the furry skin of a small animal hung down in front. The fur was striped black and white, and now Laura knew what made that smell. The skins were fresh skunk skins. What she smelled was the odor that occurs when a skunk sprays that liquid in self-defense. You know what it smells like. What is Wilder telling us here about these two men? Are we to believe they were out on the prairie and they came upon some skunks and killed them, and then they skinned them so they can wear them right away, and that they puncture the gland that holds that skunk musk, and that it spills out onto the skunk's fur, but they don't notice? They don't feel nauseated. Their eyes don't water. Nausea, that smell, watering eyes, those are human reactions to skunk spray. Wilder's depictions of these two wild men is precisely what Joy Harjo was talking about. They are not human beings. If they were, they would not be able to tolerate that smell so close to their nose and to their eyes. But according to what Wilder tells us, that smell doesn't matter to them. They just put those skins on and continue on their way into that little house on the prairie. Does that sound logical to you? I mean, if you just really think about it, a people who has been hunting and trading furs for hundreds of years would do that? Obviously, no. But why doesn't that particular passage get called out by readers? Why is it so hard for my students to see that, to understand what's wrong here? I think it's because that not human beings imagery is at work in what they're able to see when they read this page. We don't know if those two men are Cherokee or Muskogee or Osage. Those are three of the many tribal nations that were there at the time. Wilder just says Indians over and over several times in the book. The only time Wilder is tribally specific, and by that I mean names a specific tribe, is when she writes about the tall Indian. That tall Indian speaks French. He's got a personal name, and he's Osage. That particular illustration is from the anniversary edition of the book, in which all the illustrations are colorized. You can find Little House on the Prairie in over 40 different languages, and if you look in your local library catalog, you'll probably find Little House on the Prairie cookbooks, or board book versions of it, or books about the TV series, and of course you'll find DVDs of the TV series itself. That Osage man figures prominently in the Indian war cry chapter near the end of the book. At that point, Indians have gathered in camps near the little house. Afraid, Pa takes out his bullet mold, melts lead, and makes bullets. At night, Laura and her family hear Indian drums and a terrible sound that Pa says is the Indian war cry. The Indians' savage yipping makes Jack, Laura's dog, growl. This goes on, night after night. It makes Laura have a terrible ache in her middle. The tension grows, and then that Osage man appears one night, riding hard to these camps. The next day, the Indians in the camps ride away. Later, Pa finds out that the Indians had made up their minds, quote, to kill the white people who had come into Indian country. They were going to do it. But then Soldat Duchesne arrived. That's the tall Indian. Pa tells Laura that the Osage man stood up and told the other tribes that if they started to massacre us, the Osages would fight them. So the next day, all the Indians leave. When Pa hears about what Soldat Duchesne had done, he declares that Osage man to be one good Indian. Before that, the phrase, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, appears 3 times. I want you to imagine a native child reading those words in the classroom or having them read aloud by their teacher. I want you to imagine them understanding who is a good Indian. I want you to imagine that native child trying to understand all of that and maybe having to take a test, a math test or a spelling test after having heard those words. Can they concentrate? Can they do their best work? I raise these questions deliberately because the school dropout rates for Native kids is very high. Is it any wonder that that is the case? In her book, Wilder does not give readers useful information about Native people, and I don't think she cares very much about many things, including the law. Do you remember that point when Mrs. Scott says, treaties or no treaties, the land belongs to folks that will farm it? The fact is, peoples of the nations who were removed from their homelands had been farmers for hundreds of years, but that doesn't make it into these stories. All we see is Indians as hunters and gatherers roaming around. Treaties should matter, right? I mean, we don't just disregard treaties, do we? Given its prominence in the US and around the world, Little House on the Prairie perpetuates a cycle of ignorance. I want you to interrupt that circle. Reading and being inspired by Joe Harjo's poetry is not enough. You have to push aside the Wilders so that Americans can embrace truths that Harjo speaks of and truths that are part of her people's history. I won't go on any further about Little House on the Prairie, but I do want each one of you to read it and other children's books critically. What are they telling children about Native peoples? Are we depicted as human beings? Some of you recognize this as part of Cahokia Mounds. It is 95 feet tall and covers 14 acres. That's about the size of 14 football fields. The Muskogee Creeks are descendants of the people who built this structure. But what do you know about the Muskogee people? To learn some of the history from their perspective, you could visit their website and their bookstore where you can get Joy Harjo's books, but older ones too, like this. That you're looking at a reader from 1871. It has the Muskogee Creek language in it. Right now, this is called Monk's Mound, but I say right now because for the last few years, we've been in a period of reckoning. We'll look at a little bit of that. In 2018, the American Library Association changed the name of one of its awards. What was once called the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award is now the Children's Literature Legacy Award. That change was made in keeping with the association's increased attention to the values of diversity and inclusion. You may have read about the change in the New York Times or seen it on CNN. It was big news. Of course, a lot of people weren't happy about it, including William Shatner. When Native people tried to talk to him about why this was important, he blocked them. I wrote about his upset in an article for The Guardian. In the last few years, publishers have pulled several books from the market. They did this in response to criticisms, particularly ones on Twitter, over the content of those books that they pulled. One example is a birthday cake for George Washington. On page after page, we see smiling slaves. That is an inaccurate depiction of history. Soon after it came out, Scholastic withdrew it from the market. Anyone who has watched or read news over the last few months knows that around the world, statues are coming down and names are being changed, like the name of the Washington football team. And many of you know that Native peoples have our own names for places and events. You're looking at here the cover for Joseph Marshall's book, In the Footsteps of Crazy Horse. It is for middle grade readers, and in it, a Lakota grandpa takes his grandson, Jimmy, on a road trip. On that trip, Grandpa asks Jimmy if he's ever heard of the Oregon Trail, and Jimmy says yes. His grandpa tells him, before it was called the Oregon Trail, it was known by the Lakota and other tribes as Shell River Road. Grandpa also takes Jimmy to a place where white people call the site of the Fetterman Massacre, and he gives Jimmy a Lakota account of what happened there, telling Jimmy that the Lakota people call it the Battle of the 100 in the Hands. Think about that battle and how it's called. In one case, it's called the Fetterman Massacre, and in the other, it's called the Battle of the 100 in the Hands. We're talking about perspective. Massacre, battle, two words that convey a very different image. Words shape how people think of Native people. How does massacre shape how you think? How does battle shape how you think? In this story, Grandpa is giving Jimmy stories from a Lakota point of view. As we read this book, we gain a different perspective on a specific conflict, and we're asked to think about the Native people who lived in the northern parts of the country before Americans went there and called that trail the Oregon Trail. Many people across the country adore The Wizard of Oz. It features prominently in a young adult book by a Muskogee Creek writer, Cynthia Lytick Smith. In Hearts Unbroken, we meet high school students Lou and her brother Huey. They're citizens of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and they live in a suburban area in Kansas. Lou is interested in journalism, Huey's into theater. She's on the school paper, he's trying out for the theater department's production of The Wizard of Oz. He gets the part he wants, and part of what he has to do is write up the program that they will be handing out to theater goers. He did some research and learned that in 1890, Baum called for the annihilation of Native peoples. He writes up what he learned and gives it to the theater teacher, who crosses it out and tells him it is off tone, that Baum was a man of his time and that Huey shouldn't have mentioned it. Of course, it mattered to Huey. And of course, we've all seen enough in the daily news stories to know that that whole idea, man of his time, that those words are empty, that defense is empty. Today, plenty of people say horrifically racist things. With all the knowledge that Huey has learned about Baum, what's he going to do? He's in a dilemma. Will he stay in the production or not? Through the story and the characters and the conversations the characters have in Hearts Unbroken, Smith pushes us to think really hard about the many discussions we have, including the one about separating the work from the author. In the Footsteps of Crazy Horse and Hearts Unbroken are two books I recommend because they shape readers in ways that I think are important. Written by Native writers, they provide Native children with a mirror of their lives as Native people of the present day. Some of you might be familiar with Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's metaphor that books can be mirrors or windows. When the content of a book reflects you, it is a mirror. When it lets you see someone else's culture, it is a window. I wish there were hundreds of books like these two, but there aren't. Let's look at some data. Each year, the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison receives copies of children's books published that year. The staff at the center reads and sorts them in an effort to keep track of changes over time in what gets published. What you're looking at here is an infographic of data from the year 2018. The graphic incorporates the raw data from the CCBC and Dr. Bishop's metaphor. The white child on the right has lots of mirrors, lots of books that reflect a white experience. The native child on the far left has one tiny mirror. That books they received, 23 of the ones published in the United States had enough native content to be listed on the native list. So if you look at the little boy's feet, you see 23 books, 1%. Each year that this data comes out, I try to read and analyze the fiction and the picture books. If you look at the feet of the 4 children on the left, you see shards of glass. They don't have as many mirrors as the white child, and their mirrors are cracked and broken. That is part of the infographic because sheer numbers don't tell the whole story. There were 23 books with native content published in 2018 at the time this graphic was made. For my analysis of the picture books and fiction, I found that about half of those books were by non-native writers and contained stereotypical characters and content. Generally speaking, those books from major publishers by non-white writers have way more visibility than others do. That visibility means they do a lot of damage. They feed that cycle that I want you to interrupt. That cycle is driven by words, the words that Laura Ingalls Wilder gives to children, words given to anybody, really. They're very powerful. They shape how children and a child's peers view people who are not like them, and how that child and their peers will be when they become adult members of your community. They'll be making decisions about curriculum, on what books to buy for a library or a classroom, or how to vote, say, about a mascot. The emphasis of the infographic is mirrors. If we apply the window metaphor to what non-native children are getting from the problematic books in that sample, what would they see as they peer through that window? At the moment, I'm thinking about museums and the large windows on dioramas where the contents of those dioramas are created by white people. It is thought that they have the expertise to create a display that will educate people, but what do we see when we peer through those museum windows? And think about the ways that museums are shown in children's books. Do you remember Danny and the Dinosaur? In it, Danny goes to a museum. This is a very popular book. I'm sure you have read it. Do you remember this page where Danny's in the museum and he sees an Indian and a bear and an Eskimo? Obviously, these illustrations are problematic. This is not the only children's book about a museum that has problems with native content. There are much newer books that repeat this kind of problem. I'm glad to know that museum dioramas in museums have been changing slowly over time. The University of Michigan took their Indian diorama away completely in 2009, but the American Museum of Natural History in New York City went a different route. They put call-out labels on the exhibit itself and created lesson plans that teachers can download to do some critical analysis of the diorama. Changes to monuments, mascot names, museum dioramas, and children's books are happening, not because the powers that be decided they needed to be changed, but because people objected. People chose to interrupt the status quo. I'd love to see people tweet to HarperCollins about Danny and the Dinosaur. I want to end tonight by coming back to American Sunrise. In there, you will find Tobacco Origin Story. As Harjo says in the back matter, it is from a story of how the tobacco plant came to hurt people. This is a screen capture of what it looks like on my electronic copy. What I want to draw attention to is that she calls it an origin story. It tells how something came to be according to the Muskogee people. To them, it is a sacred story, and it is treated with respect. Some of you may know that Harjo's most recent book, well, no, it's not the most recent book. Some of you may know about Harjo's When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, a Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry. I hope you get that book, and I hope you visit the Living Nations, Living Worlds digital map at the website of the Library of Congress. It is Harjo's signature project as the 23rd U.S. Poet Laureate. On this interactive map, you'll find poems by Eric Gansworth and Marcy Rendon, two poets who have written some terrific books for young adults. Eric's most recent book is Apple Skin to the Core. And if you like crime fiction, you really ought to get Marcy's books about a young woman named Cash. The first one in that series is Murder on the Red River. I encourage you to keep an eye out for online events where Harjo is talking about that anthology. I watched the book launch for When the Light of the World Was Subdued from Collected Works bookstore in Santa Fe. In the Q&A, someone asked her about the use of sacred stories, wondering how someone knows what to share or not to share. That question reflects growing concerns about appropriation of story. Harjo responded that when a writer is within their nation, they know very clearly what they can write about. Some things, she said, belong with a certain place, with the people. If Harjo decided to turn the tobacco origin story into a picture book for children, she'd run into institutionalized denigration of Native origin stories. You can see what I mean by looking at card catalog entries for the Random House Book of Bible Stories and Beaver Steals Fire. Both are religious creation stories, but look at the subject field for the two books. In one you see folklore, that's for Beaver Steals Fire, but you don't see the word folklore in the catalog entry for the Bible Stories book. Why are these two stories cataloged so differently? When I go through this particular exercise looking at catalog entries with librarians, a common reaction is a defensive one. They say, well, I didn't create the catalog entry. I understand that reaction, but I want people to move beyond being defensive. I want them to do something, just like I've been asking you to do tonight. My final slide circles back to where I started. Joy Harjo said, in the American imagination, we exist as stereotypes. We're not human beings. Some perspectives are harmful. Instead of trying to undo the harm, wouldn't it be better if the harm wasn't done in the first place? Of course, I'm thinking about the stereotypes that are found throughout Wilder's book, and I hope our brief but close read of them will inspire you. I want you to be inspired to take action. I want you to interrupt the status quo in two ways. Of course, buy and share books that depict us as human beings. Join Joy Harjo in the work that she is doing. Speak up about stereotypes and speak up about good books too. I'm glad you're looking at fry bread. I've registered for that particular session that you'll be doing, I think, on Friday. And I have that slide here because if you're watching the news, you're hearing more and more about parents going to school boards and objecting to books that they think make their white children feel uncomfortable. These 5 books are among the list of many books that were banned in Central York School District in September. As I understand the news stories, those books are no longer on the banned list, but I don't know if they're actually back in the libraries, back in the classrooms. Fry bread is one, The People Shall Continue is another, We Are Grateful is a third, Indian No More is the 4th one, and the book that I co-adapted with Jean Mendoza, An Indigenous People's History of the United States for Young People, is also on that list. What I'm trying to say is that we need to speak up about problematic stereotypical books, and we need to defend and ask for the ones that make us out as human beings. That's all I've got. I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm thankful to you again for inviting me to be here tonight.
Thank you so much for your lecture, Dr. Reese. My name is Paris, and I'm a junior from Hope College studying elementary education with focuses on both English and English as a second language. We have a few questions from our English 375 class, as well as we opened up the questions to the audience on YouTube and Facebook. And so I'd like to start with a question from our class. I know you touched on this briefly in your lecture, but are there any other ways that non-Native people can support or be an advocate for Native people?
Showing up, I think, is one thing that people can do. If your school board is trying to remove fry bread, then you should go there. You should read the book, know what it says, and be able to speak about what it says. Because I think what's happening right now with a lot of these school board meetings is people haven't read the books and they don't know what's in them. They think that a book is going to make their child feel unhappy or uncomfortable. And you can say, actually, this is what the book says. So I think that's one thing that you can do is read the books and show up to defend them when they are being challenged.
Thank you. Another question that was posed in our class is, we are wondering if you believe in banning books for educational purposes if they are harmful, or are some of the harmful books worth teaching?
I have class sets of Little House on the Prairie that I take with me to do workshops. I will gladly have adults read that. I would gladly have college classes read that book, but I wouldn't hand it to little kids. That's not accurately called banning the book. Every teacher that goes into a classroom is making so many decisions every day about what they're going to do in that classroom. They're making decisions that are based on their training as educators. They don't want to miseducate the children in their classrooms. So, for example, a simple one: you wouldn't have a book in your classroom that says 2 + 2 is 5, because it's not. That's a factual error. And books like Little House on the Prairie, I went over some of the stereotypes, but there's a lot of factual errors in that book as well. So there are many ways that a teacher can say, I'm not going to use this book in the classroom because parents trust me to educate their children, not to miseducate them. So I think that teachers are making choices that are designed to educate the children in their classrooms. That's not banning, that's making choices.
Yes, thank you. That's insightful, especially for me as a future teacher as well. The next question that we have for you is, what kinds of consequences do you notice for kids who grow up with inaccurate or offensive depictions of themselves in literature or other mediums?
It's hard to do the kind of research that you would, where you would expose a child to a stereotypical image and test them in some way, like in a psychological test. It feels awkward. It feels uncaring. But research psychologists have done those kinds of studies. You could look up Stephanie Freiberg, Fryberg. She's done work in which her team of researchers will show college students a series of images. Before they show these images, they do a test of their self-esteem, and then they show them a bunch of images. That could be a sunrise, a sunset, flowers, and among those images, and if you've done any of these tests, they kind of go by fast. You're just seeing a bunch of images, and embedded in those images are stereotypical images of Native people. And so they have a pre-test where they're measuring self-esteem, and they do a post-test to see how they feel after the test. Native kids' self-esteem goes down. That's documented in her research. So these images are having an adverse effect on Native children. Unfortunately, they do the opposite for non-Native children. Their self-esteem goes up, which means they actually are playing into some preconceived ideas about who Native people are. So these are research studies by Stephanie Freiberg that everybody should be looking at. I think they have the kind of evidence. Well, it is evidence that's used by the American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association in the resolutions that they drafted that have to do with retiring mascots, of getting rid of mascots. So there's good research on that. When you look at other studies, there's a couple of other studies that I've looked at where Native researchers talk to Native students, interviewing them about how they feel about school and the outcome of their conversations, because this is qualitative research, which is conversations rather than counting. They report that students drop out and that every year they feel more and more disengaged with the content of the curriculum. It's a cumulative effect. Like in third grade, you get Little House on the Prairie. Fifth grade, you get another book. Seventh grade, you get another book. The weight of all of that, I think, contributes to the dropout rate of Native kids. And I think that there are, it's worth noting too that Native people commit suicide at very high rates as well. So I guess when I think about both of those factors, and I think about it, you're trying to defend her use of Little House on the Prairie, I'm thinking like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you lift all the kids in your classroom? Why wouldn't you make a choice for a book that would lift everybody?
Thank you for that. Building off of that, our next question for you. We're wondering what kind of changes you would like to see in youth education, especially and specifically in English, language arts, and literature courses.
Well, I've been studying and reading the work of Dr. Leilani Sabzalian. She's Salish, I think. She's up in Oregon. She's a professor up there. And she and Dr. Sarah Shear have been studying social studies standards across the country and writing some really good articles about that. One of them that they did recently is one that asks for teachers to teach about Native people whenever they're doing civics lessons. So they're honing in on sovereignty of Native nations and saying, bring that into your classroom anytime you're talking about the federal government or the state government or the local town government. It's shifting the point of view of how their students are being taught about Native people. Well, right now it's November, and this is the time of year when teachers bring out the Native content. The fact is, we're Native all year long. I didn't stop being Native. My kids don't stop being Native on December 1st. And so bringing who we are into the classrooms year round, I think is vitally important.
I would 100% agree with you on that. Thank you so much for your insight. Next, I want to bring attention to a comment from Annalise Klein. She's here all the way from Fairbanks with us tonight, and she wanted to thank you for your stories, your wisdom, and your call for window literature, as well as pose a question for you. So I'm going to share her question next. Her question is, what advice do you have for non-Native teachers who are teaching diverse books to diverse students?
Well, I think that one of the recommendations in the best practice frameworks in education, colleges of education, best practice as an idea, for that question that Annalise is asking, I would recommend that a teacher who is in, you guys are in Michigan, right? So, and you did a land acknowledgement, you named several nations in that land acknowledgement. What I would recommend that every teacher in Michigan do is to become very familiar with the websites of those nations, become familiar with the writers from those nations, become familiar with the history of those nations. They could pick one, they could pick Ojibwe, and they could read everything that Louise Erdrich has written. They could read Anton Troyer's books. What I'm getting at is rather than read broadly, they should read narrowly of a particular tribe and take a very deep dive into that particular tribal nation. Because when you do, you start to develop an eye for what's good and what's not good. So that if you suddenly come across a book that's about the Pueblo people, some of the principles that you have gained by studying one nation, you can say, I bet that doesn't sound right for the Pueblo people, rather than a superficial kind of knowledge that doesn't really help you in being able to apply your learning to another group. So that's one thing that I would suggest.
Thank you for that. We have one final question for you tonight, and it's back to a question from our English 375 class. We're really interested in knowing what recent publications in Native American Kid Lit are you especially excited about?
Okay, I have two with me here. This is Sharice's Big Voice. A Native Kid Becomes a Congresswoman. It's written by Sharice Davids. who is a congresswoman from Kansas. She's in the United States Congress right now. I love the book for many reasons. In particular, it talks about her childhood and people wondering who she was, and her asking her mom, who are we? And her mom saying, we're from the Ho-Chunk Nation. So the word nation, anytime I see the word nation in the book, is wonderful. It also is very honest about the reception that she got. She is a lesbian, and a lot of people in this country are uncomfortable with gay and lesbian people. And so that's in here too, and how she overcame all of that resistance and actually became a congressperson. So that I really like that book. I also really like another book by Cynthia Leitich Smith. This is Sisters of the Never Sea. I'm trying to get the glare out of the cover, but Sisters of the Never Sea is her retelling of Peter Pan. I have read many retellings of Peter Pan. I'm always looking for a better book than, I'm trying to make recommendations. I've not found one until now. Most people still mess up on the Native representation in there, but she doesn't. She's a Native person recounting in the author's note how she felt reading this book when she was a kid. And so she's rewritten it. And here we have here we go. This is Lily. And Lily is Black Muskogee Creek. So she's taking on that intersection of identities that we see as reality of many nations in the United States. Many nations have Black Indians within them. And so that's part of what we find in this story. So I like that a lot. There's many levels, many ways that we could talk about what she presents in Sisters of the Never Sea. But before we go back, I want to zip back to Elise. What's the question from Anchorage?
Yes, Annalise.
Annalise. One of the pages on my blog is about Native parents in Alaska who were working with the Macmillan third grade textbook and saw that the supplemental books in there were problematic. There were several of them that were deeply problematic. And so they started talking about them, and then they told the principal about them. And it became a news story. And Macmillan heard about it because they were writing to Macmillan. And then over time, Macmillan changed those books. They took them out completely. So speaking up can make such a huge difference, because they didn't take those out of just the books in Alaska. They were removed from the entire country. Macmillan took those books, not Macmillan, McGraw-Hill, took those books out of circulation in those giant reading packages that teachers use in their classrooms. So be active and speak up, because it can mean change happens. So important.
Thank you so much.
Hello, so my name is Avery and I'm a senior studying elementary English education. So Dr. Reese, on behalf of my class and our audience here, we just want to thank you for spending this time with us. We appreciate your important insight, your perspective, and your earnest conviction and your unfailing courage to speak up for what you believe in. Your presentation added much to our children's and young adult literature class as we learned tonight even more about the representation of Native American cultures in literature and the importance of reading critically. This is knowledge we will take into our future classrooms, offices, studios, families, and communities. The title of our class is Kids Save the World, and as we look into books where children have made an impact, we are reminded that even the smallest things can make a big difference. We are reminded that it's important to stand up for what you believe in, and we are reminded that everyone can make a difference. So thank you for making a difference in our world. Thank you, Dr. Reese. And also we want to thank the Big Read and the Little Read organizers for all they have done to make this event possible. And thank you to everyone who joined our event. We encourage you to check out the website and go to more Big Read and Little Read and Big Read events.
Come see Kevin when he eats fry bread.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good night.